Vietnam, 1969, somewhere near the long high hills. It was just before dawn. The jungle was still, the kind of thick, wet silence that always meant something was about to happen. My SEAL team had linked up with an Australian SAS patrol for a joint recon sweep. We weren't exactly thrilled. We respected them, sure, but working with the Aussies was like teaming up with ghosts. They moved weird, they talked less, and they carried weapons we'd never seen before. That morning, one of them had this little black gun slung across his chest, compact, stubby barrel, strange tube welded along the top. It looked unfinished. I remember asking our intel guy what it was. He just shrugged and muttered, "Sterling something." Turns out it wasn't just something. It was the L34A1 Sterling suppressed submachine gun, a weapon I would come to both admire and fear in equal measure. We were used to firepower. M16S, car, 15 seconds. Shotguns loaded with buckshot. The sound of our team opening up on a VC position was thunderous. When we hit, the jungle knew. But the Aussies? They didn't want the jungle to know. Later that day, during a perimeter sweep, I watched one of them peel off from the patrol line. He crept up to a small VC listening post, 2 men near a tree line. I was maybe 20 meters behind him, covering from an angle. He didn't run. He glided, one knee down, then the next. And when he fired, there was no crack, no recoil, just a soft metallic thud-thud, like someone punching a pillow. Both VC dropped before they even turned their heads. No screaming, no warning, no return fire. It was the first time I saw a gun that didn't sound like a gun, and a man who didn't fight like a soldier, but like something out of a nightmare. The L34A1 didn't announce its presence. It deleted people from reality. When he slipped back beside me, I couldn't help but ask, "What the hell is that thing?" He tapped the suppressor tube with one finger and grinned, "Just enough gun for the job." That night, back at the forward position, a few of us passed the weapon around. It was heavier than it looked, surprisingly quiet even with dry firing. We joked about it, called it a death stapler, but inside, I knew we were all thinking the same thing. Why don't we have this? I had spent my entire deployment chasing noise. The Aussies had figured out how to kill without making any, and as I cleaned my M16 that night, the image of those 2 silent shots kept playing in my head. Maybe power wasn't about being loud. Maybe the real power was never being heard at all. Back at base the next day, I got a better look at the thing. The L34A1 wasn't flashy. No fancy optics, no modular attachments, no bayonet lug. It wasn't built to impress. It was built to disappear. Short, compact, with a permanently integrated suppressor running almost the full length of the barrel. It fired 9mm rounds, pistol ammo, really. Laughable, some might say, compared to our 5.56mm, or the AK's 7.62. But that was the point. It wasn't a rifle. It was a tool, a scalpel in a war full of hammers. The Australians didn't care about range. They didn't care about fire superiority or mass volume of rounds downrange. Their missions weren't about body counts or clearing villages. They moved in 6-man patrols, operating days, sometimes weeks deep in VC territory. Their objective wasn't to fight. It was to observe, infiltrate, and strike only when it guaranteed results. And when they did strike, it was always up close, always personal. That's where the L34A1 shined. It didn't need to shoot through body armor. It didn't need to hit from 200 meters out. What it needed to do was eliminate a sentry at 15 feet without alerting the platoon 50 feet away. And in that role, it was perfect. Its cyclic rate was slow and controllable. The suppressor actually worked, not just reducing the bang, but removing the muzzle flash, gas puff, and recoil kick. It didn't bark like our M16S. It exhaled. It took me a while to wrap my head around it. I came from a world where the louder the fight, the more heroic it felt. Kick indoors, fire and maneuver, shock and awe. The Australians didn't want shock. They wanted silence. They weren't trying to overpower the enemy. They were trying to haunt them. One Aussie told me they used the L34A1 during silent kill operations, ambushes in total darkness, where only one man fired and nobody ever heard it. One time, They even cleared a VC bunker line without waking the men in the next room. That kind of precision requires a different kind of thinking, a different kind of trust in your weapon. You don't carry the L34A1 because you want a firefight. You carry it because you plan to avoid one entirely. In our world, that kind of control felt alien, almost arrogant, but watching how they moved through the jungle, how the birds didn't even scatter when they passed, I understood. They didn't carry the strongest gun. They carried the right one. And in a war where every mistake cost blood, being quiet wasn't just tactical, it was sacred. The jungle in Vietnam wasn't just a place, it was a predator. It watched, it listened, and it punished noise. We learned that quickly during our first joint operation with the Australians. Our SEAL team moved fast, ran tight formations, cleared through contact zones with fire and violence. It worked for us. But the Aussie SAS? They didn't move like us. They flowed. No crunching leaves. No snapping twigs. No whispered chatter on the radio. They were ghosts in camouflage, and when they did shoot, it was often just one man, one target, one shot from that ugly little black gun with the built-in suppressor. The L34A1 wasn't designed for war the way we imagined it. It was designed for a specific kind of war, the kind fought up close, in the dark, where silence was survival. Their missions weren't glorified. No big headlines, no dramatic footage. They were tasked with surgical objectives. Infiltrate enemy zones, mark artillery coordinates, eliminate key personnel, disrupt logistics silently. These weren't firefights. These were removals. And to do that, they needed a weapon that didn't give away the moment. I remember one Aussie trooper, quiet guy, named McRae, told me this over a cigarette during downtime. He said, "You know what happens when you shoot a loud weapon in the jungle?" I shrugged. "Everyone hears. The birds, the frogs, the dogs. You don't just wake the patrol, you wake the whole forest. And the jungle? It talks back." That stuck with me. To the SAS, a loud shot wasn't just tactically dangerous, it was a failure of discipline. It meant someone had gotten too close, or the plan had gone sideways. The L34A1 was their insurance policy, their scalpel, their final whisper. They didn't just carry it into missions, they built tactics around it. 2-man stalk teams with the L34A1 moved ahead of the main patrol, eliminating lookouts before the rest of the unit even arrived. If an ambush was set, the first shots were suppressed, intended to confuse, disorient, delay detection. Sometimes they didn't fire at all, but having that weapon meant they could, and that changes everything. Because war, especially jungle war, isn't always about how many bullets you fire. It's about how long you can stay hidden, how many steps you can take before they realize you're there, and what you can do before they fire back. The L34A1 didn't make the SAS invincible. It made them invisible until it was far too late. For us SEALs, it was like discovering a new layer to the battlefield. We weren't just fighting men, we were fighting silence, and in that silence, the SAS had found a way to win. We were used to winning fights by hitting hard and fast, suppressive fire, speed, violence of action. That was the SEAL way. But after a few joint ops with the Aussie SAS, we started noticing something that didn't quite fit into our playbook. They killed more people with fewer bullets. At first, it was hard to accept. We had better gear, or so we thought. We had M16s, CAR 15 seconds, grenade launchers, radios in every pack. The SAS moved light, with almost no spare gear, and their main shooter often carried that strange little suppressed Sterling, the L34A1. I remember one night op in particular. Intel said a VC courier unit was expected to cross a footbridge just before midnight. Our SEAL team set up on one side of the riverbank, the Aussies took the other. We figured we'd handle it with overlapping fields of fire textbook stuff. Then the VC arrived. 4 of them, moving in a column, AKs slung, relaxed but alert. Before we even keyed our radios, thup thup thup, 3 soft pops cut through the still air, no muzzle flash, no echo. 3 VC dropped instantly. The 4th froze for a second too long. Thup. All 4 were down, no screaming, no return fire, no need for us to shoot at all. We watched it happen from across the water, and I remember thinking, that wasn't a firefight. That was a quiet erasure. When we regrouped, I asked the SAS team leader, half joking, "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" He said, "We don't shoot to fight. We shoot to end the conversation." It wasn't arrogance. It was clarity. Cold, quiet clarity. That's when it hit me. Firepower isn't always the most dangerous thing on the battlefield. Sometimes, it's the thing that doesn't make a sound. Sometimes it's the guy with the slow step and the weird gun who ends the fight before you even know it started. The L34A1 was built exactly for that moment. No recoil, suppressed barrel, low flash signature, and a design that favored accuracy at close quarters. It wasn't about putting dozens of rounds down range, it was about one round, placed perfectly, and moving on. And the thing that really shook me? The enemy never had time to react. No one knew what direction the fire came from. Sometimes, the VC didn't even realize someone was hit until the patrol failed to respond. The silence created confusion, and confusion created fear. That's something no rifle manual can teach you. When you make the jungle go quiet and stay that way, the enemy starts seeing ghosts where there are none. The SAS didn't just kill the VC, they made them afraid of the dark, and I couldn't help but wonder how many of our fights could have been won before they even began. At first, we were just curious. The Sterling L34A1 looked like a toy compared to our gear. Ugly, outdated, and slow-firing on paper, it didn't impress anyone. But after seeing it in action a few times, curiosity turned to envy. We started asking questions. How far can it reach? Can you fire it wet? What's the suppressor made of? The Aussies answered with their usual dry humour. "You don't measure this one in meters, mate. You measure it in seconds of silence." We laughed. But not really. After that bridge ambush, we asked to try it on the range. The first thing you noticed when you pulled the trigger was what you didn't hear. No snap, no bark, just a gentle hiss and a soft thud. The recoil felt like flicking a paperweight. In semi-auto, it was almost boring. In full auto, it was eerie, controlled, ghost-like. It didn't kick, it whispered. For close-quarter jungle patrols, it was ideal. You could fire it one-handed while crawling. You could conceal it under a poncho or sling it behind a pack. It didn't announce its presence. That was the difference. Our M16S screamed. The L34A1 vanished. Some of our guys started writing home asking command if there was any way to requisition one. Of course, that went nowhere. It wasn't standard U.S. issue, and the paperwork alone could take months. Besides, unofficial weapons didn't sit well with the brass. They liked their war loud, uniform, predictable. But out here in the bush, predictability got you killed. A few of the Aussie troopers let us borrow theirs during joint ops. It wasn't official, just quiet trades between men who understood what worked. One of our point men, Dana, used it during a night recon when we suspected a VC outpost was setting up claymores along a trail. He took out a lone sentry without triggering a single alarm. We watched from cover as the enemy kept working like nothing had happened. 20 minutes later, we took the site clean. When Dana came back, all he said was, "I want one." So did the rest of us. But it wasn't just the weapon we craved. It was the freedom it gave, the ability to operate in shadows, to strike without warning, to move without leaving a sound behind. The L34A1 wasn't just a suppressed subgun. It was a force multiplier in the hands of the right man. And the Aussies were the right men. They didn't carry it because they were trying to be different. They carried it because they had figured out what we were only beginning to understand. In a jungle war, silence wins. As much as we wanted it, we knew the L34A1 wasn't for everybody. It wasn't a gun you handed to just any soldier. You didn't issue it to a scared kid on his first jungle patrol. You didn't throw it into a chaotic firefight hoping it would turn the tide. No, this weapon belonged to a certain kind of man. The kind who didn't panic when the trail disappeared. The kind who didn't need backup to finish a mission. The kind who could slide a blade or pull a trigger with the same cold detachment. It was a killer's tool. A professional's weapon, and the Australian SAS used it like an extension of themselves. There was something almost ritualistic in the way they handled the L34A1. They didn't baby it or worship it, they just respected what it was, a purpose-built machine, clean, balanced, and unforgiving. One SAS trooper told me, "This isn't for gunfights, it's for decisions." I asked what he meant. He said, "By the time you pull the trigger on this, you've already won, or you're already dead." That stuck with me. This wasn't a shoot-your-way-out weapon. It wasn't meant for suppressing fire or laying down bursts through bamboo walls. It was meant for one shot, one kill. No questions, no noise. If you missed, you didn't get another chance. And that's what made it dangerous, not just to the enemy, but to the man carrying it. You had to be calm under pressure. You had to choose your moment. The L34A1 demanded patience, precision, and absolute clarity. It didn't give you room to flinch. Some of our guys weren't ready for that. One SEAL borrowed it during a close-quarters clearing op in a partially collapsed VC tunnel. Tight space, near pitch black. He panicked when he saw movement and missed his first shot. The second went wide. The third jammed. By the time he scrambled to clear it, a VC had already lunged at him with a knife. He made it out, but barely. After that, we understood. This wasn't a magic gun, it was a scalpel, and in the wrong hands, a scalpel does more damage to the surgeon than to the enemy. The Australians didn't carry the L34A1 because it was cool or different. They carried it because their mission profile matched its soul. Silent approaches, assassination patrols, disruption raids at night. They weren't trying to win by numbers. They were trying to shift the battlefield in inches and shadows. The L34A1 didn't forgive hesitation. It rewarded certainty. And if you didn't have that, you had no business pulling the trigger. By the time we'd run a few joint missions with the Australians, the contrasts between us were impossible to ignore, not just in how we fought, but why we fought the way we did. We were SEALs, born out of the need for direct action, trained to hit hard, fast, and with overwhelming violence. Our doctrine favoured momentum, kick in the door, clear the objective, move to exfil. That approach made sense for our missions, raids, rescues, sabotage, and heavy-hitting recon. When the bullets started flying, we wanted to be louder, faster, and more decisive than the enemy. The Australians, they were different. They didn't chase speed or firepower, they chased invisibility. While we planned for entry points and kill zones, they planned how not to be seen at all. Their goal wasn't to eliminate a squad, it was to watch that squad for days, then remove only one man without the others even noticing. And their weapon of choice, the L34A1, reflected that philosophy perfectly. We joked about it, of course. That's how soldiers handle things we don't quite understand. One of our guys called it the whisper tube, another said it looked like a plumbing experiment. But the truth was that suppressed subgun embodied everything the SAS believed in: precision over power, patience over tempo, silence over spectacle. We operated like hammer blows. They operated like scalpels in the dark. I remember one op where we were tasked with hitting a known VC staging hut. The plan was a coordinated assault. SEALs from the front, SAS from the rear. Our breach went hot immediately, flashbangs, full auto, shouting. The enemy returned fire, and for a few minutes, it was chaos. After we cleared, we found 2 dead VC lying just outside the back door. Clean kills, no alarm raised. The rest of the compound hadn't even known they were gone. That was the SAS contribution. 2 quiet deaths, 0 noise, maximum impact. We respected that, but we also knew it wasn't us. Not entirely. We were still built to move with force, to adapt quickly and hit where it hurt. The SAS were designed for surgical disruption and deep infiltration. Different DNA, but both necessary in a war like Vietnam. The jungle demanded both blades and bombs. We learned from them. We started carrying smaller profiles. We taped down our gear to avoid noise. We rethought when to shoot and when to wait. And slowly, we stopped trying to be louder than the fight. We started listening too, because when you fight beside men who treat every sound like a bullet, you begin to understand that silence is not the absence of war, it's a weapon of its own. And in that silence, the SAS thrived. Vietnam taught us a lot of things, most of them the hard way. But one of the quietest, most enduring lessons came not from an ambush or an after-action report, but from a weapon barely anyone knew existed outside the shadows. The L34A1 Sterling suppressed submachine gun. It wasn't mass-produced. It didn't win any awards. It wasn't sexy like the M16 or feared like the AK-47. But for the men who carried it, and for those of us who witnessed it in action, it became a symbol of something greater than firepower. It became a symbol of control. The Aussies never bragged about the gun. They didn't flex with it or pose for photos. Hell, some of them didn't even like carrying it unless the mission required it. But when it was time to move through enemy territory like shadows, to slip into a jungle bunker undetected, or to remove a target without waking the next man over, they didn't want anything else in their hands. And neither did we. Years later, when I returned home and started training younger SEALs, I found myself telling stories about that weird little Sterling. Most of them had never heard of it. They knew the MP5SD, of course our later go-to for suppressed CQB, but I always made the connection. Before there was the MP5SD, I'd say there was a stubby little British gun in the hands of Aussie ghosts, and it changed how we thought about killing. That got their attention, because that's the real legacy. The L34A1 didn't win wars. It didn't change the tide of history, but it changed mindsets. It challenged the idea that louder was better, that more was stronger, that real warriors needed to be seen to be feared. The SAS knew otherwise. They fought from the edge, deep in the bush, far from support. They didn't count kills, they didn't raise flags, they just did the job and left silence behind them. And that silence? It was deafening. I don't know where all those L34A1s ended up. Some probably rusted away in arms lockers, others were retired without ceremony. But I like to think that their spirit, the philosophy behind them, still lives in the way modern special operators think. Today, you see small teams working with surgical precision. Quiet insertions, controlled engagements, suppressed fire, disruption, not destruction. All of that started somewhere. Maybe, just maybe, it started in the mud of Vietnam, when a 5-man SAS patrol vanished into the jungle with a submachine gun no one could hear, and came back without firing more than a dozen rounds. No fireworks, no medals, just results. And as someone who saw it firsthand, I'll say this. In the end, it wasn't about the gun. It was about how deadly silence could be, in the right hands.